Well, it's time now for Grow in English with the News. Your free, simple, and interesting study of English by looking at pronunciation and words that may be new to you to help you to grow in English. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Coming from the southern United States, I'm your host, Paul, and it's so good to hear from you today. Good to see you today. Our story comes from, well, I think here in the United States. Today's story is chicken Hoisin Stir Fry. So it's a little bit of a recipe, a little different from what we've done the past couple of days. So we'll get to that here in just a moment, but hope that you're doing well today. And I'm so glad that you could join us for our study as we continue to grow in English. Been hearing from a lot of you offline and through email, and have had some questions, in fact, that have come up. And I'm thinking maybe on Friday that we're going to have a question and answer day on Friday rather than reading a news story. We may do that coming up not only this Friday, but other Fridays as well. So I hope that you'll stay tuned and stay with us through the week for just that. Well, let's get to the story, shall we? We won't delay any longer, and let's notice the headline: Fast Hoisin Stir Fry solves the issue of dry chicken breast. Now, this particular story comes from the Associated Press through Fair Use, and we appreciate that so very much. And the story begins like this. Boneless, skinless chicken breast is the most purchased cut of poultry in the U.S., but it's easy to overcook and generally bland. Thankfully, the solution to both problems happens to be both simple and fast: a boldly flavored stir fry. Well, there may be some words here that you do not recognize in this first set, or this first paragraph anyways. Let's see. As you know, chicken breast can be overcooked very easily. When I go to the store sometimes or go to the fast food place, I do not ask for a chicken breast just for that reason, because they throw the breast, the thigh, the leg, they throw all of that in together. And if you get the breast, most of the time it's overcooked. So this is what the article is about, especially in the stir fry situation. So let's notice a couple of things here. First of all, the word bland. Bland. Have you ever heard of this word, bland, before? Well, what is bland? Well, it's a new word for us today, and it's pronounced phonetically. I've got it spelled here, bl, and then and. So bland, bland. And that's a food that's mild or tasteless, and needs some spices, needs a little salt and pepper, something like that. But the word can also apply to people as well. Someone who just isn't very exciting. You can see the picture of the man there. He's looking at bland food, but he looks a little bland himself, doesn't he? Bland, a food that is mild or tasteless. It needs some spices. And so we need to spicing those things up. And again, let's see, let's go back to the sentence here. It's easy to overcook and generally bland. And so that's why we've got some solutions here, we hope, to make this interesting recipe. By the way, this is going to be a short story today. Just want to give you a heads up on that. For this recipe from our book, the book that was provided to the Associated Press, Cook What You Have, which draws on pantry staples to assemble easy weeknight meals, we rely on hoisin sauce. Hoisin. Thick, sweet, and rich with umami, the fermented soy-based sauce hits several flavor notes at once by mixing it with a bit of soy sauce and dry sherry or sake. That's a Japanese alcoholic drink, of course, for acidity. We balance its richness so it's not overly sweet. They used a pretty deep word for that, so I substituted overly sweet there. Well, in this particular paragraph, a couple of things, and of course, this is from the American standpoint of those who may be making this particular dish, as many people here in the States try to prepare things very fast or have meals that can be done very quickly. And as it mentions here, I'll try to have this a little bit bigger for you next time, but as it talks about here, a weeknight meal, most of the time people will go off to work and then they'll come home. Everybody's tired, the husband, the wife, all of the kids are hungry, and so they want something that's easy to assemble, as it says here in this particular paragraph. But there's one word that I want to key in on, and that word is staples. Staples. Do you know what a staple is? I've got a, let's see, somewhere here, I've got a staple gun. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's look at this new word. Staples. Well, I've got it phonetically spelled here as stay and then pulls. Those are two separate words, but again, if this is your first time to join us, I'd like to do these words phonetically with things that we already know or are easy to consider. Staples. Well, there's two definitions to a staple. A staple is something that is an important part of a diet, and usually that's referred to in a national sense. For example, if you go to the Philippines, I was there back in 2019, and they have a saying, rice is life. And you, every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you have to have some rice because rice is life. And there's some impoverished people there in the Philippines, and I have known them to just eat rice. And if they eat rice and that's all they have, then they're satisfied. They're happy. Similarly, I went to India just not too long ago in October and November, and you see this piece of bread or this roti or other bread that's another staple in India. Indians eat a lot of rice as well, but these two would be considered staples, part of their diet. But also, definition number 2, a staple is a piece of metal holding papers together from a staple machine. I just happen to have one right here. This is what we call I've always called it a staple machine, but inside here are some staples, and you take that and you mash it together, and it puts pieces of paper together. And that's our second definition. But the definition that we're concerned with is staple, an important part of a particular diet. And so as it says here, this recipe pulls or draws on pantry staples, things that you already have, things that are in there that you normally probably would buy each and every week, you see. Easy to assemble. And some of the things that you want to mix with this, as it mentions, you don't want it to be too rich and not overly sweet. So let's move over to the next paragraph. To ensure the chicken remains tender, we slice it crosswise against the grain, which shortens the muscle fibers, so the muscle, or the meat rather, contracts less. Let me start that over, shall we? Even I'm getting mixed up. See, this English business is not easy. To ensure the chicken remains tender, we slice it crosswise against the grain, which shortens the muscle fibers, so the meat contracts less when exposed to the high heat of a stir fry, and making the slices only 1/4 inch thick. Means it needs only a few minutes to cook before the sauce is added to the pan. Now, as far as reading comprehension, what this is talking about, it says so that the chicken can remain tender. You don't want it tough like the breast meat usually is. We slice it crosswise. That's going to be our next word, by the way, so stand by. Against the grain. If you look at any piece of meat will have a grain. My father has a fireplace. I'm in my parents' home, and we used to go cut wood, and there's a certain grain that the wood has. There's a certain grain that the meat has. In other words, there's a direction that the muscles go or the fibers go. And so you cut against the grain. You don't cut with it, you cut against it. And that shortens the muscle fibers in this particular piece of chicken. And even I'm having a problem because this word is pronounced two different ways. And I'm having a problem with my brain clicking tonight as I'm recording this. But anyways, it contracts. We'll talk about that too in just a minute. And so that's what he's talking about, the way you cut it and the exposure to the heat. All right, let's notice our next word. That's what we're here for, isn't it? Crosswise. What is crosswise? Have you ever heard this particular phrase? Well, it's a new word for us, crosswise. And I've spelled it phonetically this way, K-R-O-S-S, cross. And then I've got the word eye, like your eyeball that you see out of, a W before that, a Z after that, and you put all that together, crosswise, crosswise, crosswise. Well, that means something cut diagonally or in a cross-type pattern. Do you see this? Looks like a mango there or some fruit in the picture, and you see how that they have cut it in different directions. They're cutting it crosswise in a cross-type pattern. That's what it means. And you do that, as it talks about here in this particular article, you slice it crosswise against the grain. That shortens the muscle fibers, and the meat contracts less. Contracts less. I'm still having a problem with it. So I know you're going to have a problem with it too. And when I say that, I mean, if I have a problem with it, it's not that easy. So we're all learning English together. I feel like I'm learning it today too. That's going to be our next word, though. Let's go ahead and get to it since we're having such a problem with it here. This particular word is a new word for us, contracts. Contracts. That's the way that it's pronounced. Going back to the article here, the muscle fibers so that the meat contracts less. Well, what does it mean to contract? Well, first of all, here's our phonetic pronunciation, contracts. Contracts. Well, it means to shrink or to shorten or reduce in size. If you've ever cooked, for those of you that are able to cook hamburgers or use beef, if you ever cook a hamburger patty and you make it round and maybe that thing's that big and you put it on the griddle or you put it in a frying pan or in a grill, what's going to happen? That thing is going to contract. It's going to get smaller and smaller. And by the time it's done, sometimes it's, depending how much fat you have in it, it's almost half the size. Chicken can do that. Other forms of meat can do that as well because you're taking out the moisture or you're taking out the fat. But to contract, contracts as it's spelled there, if it wasn't plural, it would be contract. To shrink, to shorten or reduce in size. But there's also another definition for this word, but it's pronounced differently. I don't want to confuse you, but I don't want you to leave without knowing this bit of information. A legal document, but it's pronounced contracts, and that's the way I've been pronouncing it a time or two. Contracts, K-O-N, as I'm spelling it phonetically, contracts. Well, a contract is a legal document, but in this article, contracts. Isn't that one of the wonderful things about English? It's what makes it very difficult sometimes, isn't it? So the meat is going to contract, get smaller if you don't cut it in the proper manner. All right, let's move forward here and notice next. Freshly grated ginger. That sounds good, doesn't it? And crushed red pepper brighten the dish, and snappy bell pepper adds a welcome contrast to the tender chicken. The cooking goes quickly, so be sure the ingredients are prepped and at the ready before you head to the stove. Serve with steamed rice. Well, of course, we have to have some steamed rice, right? Well, let's notice in this a couple of things. I do have a word we're about to get to, and we're going to highlight the word contrast. But grated ginger, you take a grater and you put that ginger on it, and it makes it in very small pieces. So that's what to grate means. And of course, you know crushed red pepper, you know what that is. And it says here, though, to brighten the dish. Well, you remember we started out with this talking about something that is bland, something that's tasteless, something that needs a little brightening. And that's what it's talking about here. You put some of that grated ginger, you put some crushed red pepper on this chicken, and it brightens the dish. And then it says something here about snappy bell pepper. What does that mean, snappy? Well, you know, if I snap my fingers, it's like this. Well, if you take some bell pepper and you cut it into slices, you can take that bell pepper and it'll snap just like that. And that's what it's talking about. But it's saying, or it means for you to add the bell pepper in later so it doesn't cook so much. All right, the word I want us to look at as we get ready to wrap up here a little bit early adds a welcome contrast. This grated ginger, crushed pepper, snappy bell pepper, all these colors adding a welcome contrast to the tender chicken. Do you know what to contrast means? Well, this is our new word. All right. Contrast, as we spell it phonetically here. Contrast. To contrast is something that proves to be different than another item next to it. Well, what does that mean? Well, it could be of a person or food or object. Anything can contrast. In the picture here, you see some oranges, and then you see I think that's a bell pepper or poblano pepper, but nevertheless, it's green, and the green is a big contrast to the orange. There's a lot of things that we can contrast. I'm a big man. When I went to India, there were some very, very tiny, skinny people. It was, in fact, one of my best friends there is much, much smaller than I. A big contrast of people. Some people dress up very nicely. They'll have a tie and they'll have a suit. And then some of us dress in just casual clothes like this. That's another contrast, you see. Well, in the article, it's talking about contrasting this very pale, beige, white, whatever you want to call the chicken, the cooked chicken. Of course, it starts out pink, and then it turns into a very light tan or beige color. Oh, by the time you add some red pepper in there, by the time you add some grated ginger, by the time you add this snappy bell pepper, then that's going to be a big contrast to that tender chicken, because some of those things, particularly the bell pepper, and if you add other vegetables, it's going to crunch when you eat it. And so that's the contrast. You have the soft and tender chicken contrasting with the very snappy, crunchy vegetables. And that's what's the good thing about it. And as it says here, the ingredients or the cooking goes quickly. Chicken usually cooks very fast. And it says here to make sure the ingredients are prepped. I didn't put this as a new word, but prepped, what does that mean? Well, it means to prepare something beforehand. There's a lot of people today in today's world that are busy. It takes two jobs to make ends meet, as we say here in America. In other words, it takes two people working, the husband and the wife, or whomever, to have enough money to pay all the bills and get everything straightened out in the household. So a common thing is to prep prepare meals beforehand. A lot of people do the preparation at night, and then when they come home the next day, they're able to cook the meals very fast and rapidly so they can feed their family. So be sure the ingredients are prepped. Again, I didn't highlight that word. I probably should have, because you may not know what that is, but of course a lot of folks here in the States do. All right, that's, I think, our last word. But I want to leave you with this before we leave today. Words to remember. So remember these words, at least these three. We went over several, but I want you to look at these three and try to use them in a sentence if at all possible. Bland. We read that at the beginning of the story. Here's a sentence for you. This soup is very bland. It needs some salt or pepper in it. If we were in the Philippines or in India, it needs some chili in it. Indonesia, Malaysia, they love things hot. I had a friend I went to college with from Indonesia, and she loved things just as hot as she could get them. As soon as she had a soup, or if we went to some Asian cuisine restaurant, the first thing she would ask for is hot sauce or hot pepper. And she's just putting that stuff on, and even her hair is sweating. She's taking a napkin and wiping off. And I would tell her, how in the world can you eat that so hot? And she says, oh, it's so good. And I think about her when I think about this sentence of this soup is very bland. There's no taste. It needs some salt or pepper in it. So try to use that word if you can, bland. Staples. Staples. Remember, staples are something that there's two definitions, the metal staple, but in this article, staple is something that is used as a part of a culture, or for example, the rice and the bread that we talked about. We're almost out of rice. Well, you know that's one of our everyday staples. We can't run out of it. So you need some rice. So go out and get one of your staples. You might say also, if you're trying to make up a sentence or talk to some people, do you have some bread? You know, that's one of my staples I have to have every day. Something like that. Try to use that in a sentence if you can. And then finally, contrast. The curtains do not match the chairs. It's too much of a contrast. See, I'm still messing up today, aren't I? Oh, my goodness. The curtains do not match the chairs. It's too much of a contrast. Maybe you have some curtains that are very bright red, and then you have a chair that's very, very black, or maybe the curtains are very, very white, and then you have a chair that's red or black. But anyways, the colors are very opposite each other. They contrast with each other. They're not exactly in sync with each other. They're not together. It's in contrast. Maybe you see somebody, certainly don't insult anybody, but if you see somebody who has, for example, some clothes on, a shirt that's one color and pants that are another color, you might go up to them and say, that's a big contrasting outfit you have today. Well, that might be a compliment to them. They might appreciate that. That might be the look that they wanted you to go for. So bland, staples, and contrast. Try to see if you can use those particular words in your day today. Well, we've come to the end of the program today of our lesson and the end of the program. Tomorrow, you'll not want to miss another very interesting story that we have to help you grow in English. This is Paul, and I hope that you have a great day or great night wherever you are, and I hope further that we see you tomorrow. Hey, don't forget to like and subscribe, please, and we will see you coming up tomorrow.